It's with the greatest pleasure that I get to introduce our next plenary speaker, Kremen. Claire is the President's Excellence Chair in Biodiversity at the University of British Columbia. She's an ecologist and applied conservation biologist. Her research focuses on the intersection between agricultural land use and biodiversity conservation. And I know I'm not alone in being one of those people that's been incredibly inspired by the way she's tackled these fundamental issues of how we produce food, live good lives, and look after the nature that we all love and care about. So please help me look lively and warmly welcome Claire to the stage.
Good morning, everybody. It is such an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I do want to give a big shout out to the conference organizers, to Misha and Vanessa and Hugh and everyone else who behind the scenes has put together this fantastic conference. And I myself feel like I've learned so much here, particularly grateful to have been able to listen to so many inspiring talks by Indigenous members of our group here on Indigenous-led conservation. Let's see. So, conservation science is a really big tent. It includes a lot of disciplines, a lot of strongly held opinions, a lot of types of people, a lot of framings. And the late, great Georgina Mace attempted to make sense of this in a paper she wrote about 10 years ago, where she traced sort of the evolution or the changes in conservation framings and in motivations, and the ways that conservation has changed. So starting back in the 1960s, sort of nature for itself and nature despite people was a main framing, with a main motivation being threats to nature from people. And by the way, the first Society for Conservation Biology meeting was held in Bozeman, Montana in 1987. And it was very much in that light of nature despite people. And I know that because I was actually at that conference, which then you can kind of guess how old I am. But anyway, so motivations did change, and people started to think a lot more about actually trying to get more people interested in conservation through thinking about what does nature do for people and how are people in nature embedded, and so the reliance of people on nature. But one thing that was not in Georgina's framing was a notion that is becoming more and more prominent, and is definitely very prominent here, and I'm glad to see in this conference, and that is a framing where there is no separation of people and nature, and that's the notion of biocultural diversity. And so biocultural diversity, one of the really fundamentally important differences about this framing is not only the idea that humans steward nature, and that humans are not always destructive of nature, but they're the stewards of nature, but also actually generative of biological diversity. So here's a definition of biocultural diversity from Maffei and Dilts. The interlinked diversity of life in nature and culture, an integrated whole formed by biodiversity, cultural diversity, and linguistic diversity, creating a wellspring of vitality and resilience for life on the planet. And so all these framings are still very much present, and very much present in the conference today. They're all valid, although they do sometimes create tensions within our discipline. So food really embodies biocultural diversity, and it's in two ways. So for one thing, I can't think of anything that I eat that isn't biological. And if you think of anything, do let me know. But really, no, food is biodiversity, and biodiversity is food. And the second thing is the search for food through hunting, gathering, and cultivating foods has led to the generation of much biocultural diversity. So wild harvest, we harvest just thousands and thousands of plants and animals across the globe. And we've been able to develop or to find, identify sufficient and nutritious diets in some of the most extreme environments, from the high Arctic to desert environments. And in the process of wild harvest, this was often accompanied with landscape modifications that created biocultural, biodiverse landscapes, some of which are still found today, such as this landscape, the Garry Oak and Camas Meadows in British Columbia, near where I live. And so these meadows were really created by the use of fire by First Nations people. And the fire was used to open up the landscape and to attract deer to the growing vegetation so that deer could be hunted. And in addition, they've weeded and cultivated these lilies, these camas lilies, for their bulbs, which were a staple food and a culturally significant food. And these meadows, though, now host hundreds of at-risk plant species, only places where some of these plant species are found. And so they're important, conservation reservoirs, but they rely on continued biocultural management. And the wild harvest and early cultivation practices also ultimately led to crop and livestock domestication, leading to the crops and livestock that we now rely on for food. These processes by which early peoples domesticated these crops also played out in creating a huge amount of variety and diversity within these crop species. These are land races of corn in just one country, in Mexico. There are even many more land races of corn. Each of these corns has its own culinary use. So really farmers, by selecting seeds and their cultivation practices, have generated a great deal of biodiversity within crops. We now know that the cultivation, the domestication of crops did not occur in a single location, which is what I was taught in grade school, but was actually spread across the world in many centers and happening in the early Holocene and later as simultaneously. And so along with a lot of other evidence, archaeological evidence, anthropological, and paleological evidence, we also know that since 12,000 years before the current era or before, most woodlands and drylands were inhabited at low population densities, creating the potential for these biocultural landscapes and really kind of putting into context the notion of wilderness, is what is wilderness. And this brings me to my land acknowledgement. I am grateful to live, work, and play on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples in British Columbia. For thousands of years, these peoples hunted and gathered on these lands and in the seas, tended estuarine root gardens, camas gardens, and forest gardens, and developed knowledges and narratives that allowed them to care for the lands and the seas and the 7 generations of people to follow. I'm grateful also to have learned about the ways of North American original peoples from authors and scholars who've studied them, people like Clint Carroll and Kyle White, and Kat Anderson and Nancy Turner. And I also want to say that, true disclosure, I have book learning about biocultural diversity and these management practices. But here at this conference, there are many people who are actually doing it on the land and are bringing health back to lands that have been really devastated by our industrializing processes. And so my hat is off to you, and thank you from my heart for bringing back land into health, and just a big shout out to those of you who are doing this important work. And we really need the kind of knowledge that is behind biocultural diversity management because agriculture is basically killing our planet. Intensive food production is the single biggest destructive impact on biodiversity and planetary health. It's using 45 to 50% of habitable land, sucks up 70% of fresh water, and is the biggest polluter of our air, of our lands, and of our waters. So how can we do agriculture better, and what can we learn from biocultural management to inspire conservation in agricultural working lands? So the working lands conservation concept is about protecting biodiversity in spaces shared by people and nature in the human-dominated lands, whether they're rangelands, farmlands, or forests, but any lands that are producing food, fiber, fuel, energy, forage, excuse me, forest products. These are our working lands. They often may include, they may often be land mosaics that include semi-natural habitat patches as well. The working lands conservation concept is really a complement to protected area conservation because, of course, we need our large, relatively, our large, as pristine as possible, core areas for sensitive species where people would be maybe at low population densities or not there at all. So working lands conservation is really to take place in the buffer zones around these core areas and to help build in the connectivity that we need through stepping stone corridors or other kinds of corridors. So how does working lands conservation work? Essentially, the idea is managing the landscape for multiple functions and leading to this sort of a spider diagram, this basket of production and also ecosystem services. So it's got to be productive. We need to be able to produce forest products, livestock products, and crops in these landscapes for ourselves, but we need to sustain and regenerate the ecosystem services that are behind and that support this production, because without that, we're not going to be able to continue producing things to make ourselves healthy in the future. And in order to support and regenerate those ecosystem services, we need to maintain biodiversity in these landscapes because it's the biodiversity that provides these ecosystem services. And in order to support that biodiversity, we also need connectivity and connected landscapes. So the hypothesis that I'll be exploring today is that using something called agricultural diversification practices can promote this multifunctionality and connectivity in agricultural landscapes. So what are these agricultural diversification practices? I'll be showing you 5 basic strategies of practices arrayed from field to landscape scale. And why are they called diversification practices? It's because all of them are practices that essentially encourage biological diversity to enter into agricultural landscapes and supply those ecosystem services that we need. So starting with the soils, 2 basic kinds of things that have to happen. We need to add organic amendments into the soils to support the entire below ground food chain, from the microbes, the microbial diversity, all the way up to the earthworms. And we need to reduce the disturbance to the soil so that habitat structure for those organisms can be maintained and they can live there. And then those organisms are providing a lot of soil fertility and they're creating soils that absorb water, very important. The next level is crop diversity, and that can happen either through time, through crop rotations, or through space by intercropping or polyculture, growing multiple crops in the same field. And that's important because it suppresses a lot of, this kind of crop diversification helps to suppress pests and diseases, and thus reduces the need for a lot of chemical inputs, and also produces a lot of complementarities among crops in terms of nutrient use and even nutrient capture, like nitrogen fixation, so that we can use less fertilizers. And also provides more resources for pollinators and natural enemies. The next level is integrating trees and animals back into crop fields through methods like agroforestry, silvopasture, and mixed crop livestock systems. So the trees, of course, bring habitat in for quite a few species and provide, again, helping to support things like pest control. And the trees and cows and other livestock also provide nutrients back into the soil. So those are, and stabilize soils as well. And then adding structural heterogeneity into crop landscapes through growing borders around crop fields, through hedgerows, floral strips, windbreaks, again, providing a lot of habitat for a variety of species, including ecosystem service providing species, stabilizing soils, and purifying water. And finally, at the landscape scale, having heterogeneous agricultural landscapes through a mixture of crop diversity in different parts of the landscape, different crops grown, woodlands, forests, and also embedded semi-natural habitat. These heterogeneous landscapes support a lot of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So what's the evidence for multifunctionality? I'll start at the field scale, and I'll be showing you a secondary meta-analysis. That is a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. So here, we got data from 69 primary meta-analyses that represent over 40,000 original comparisons. So it's just a huge amount of data going into this analysis. And in this case, each meta-analysis compared a diversified practice to a more simplified practice. An example would be comparing a hedgerow to a bare edge. Using these different buckets of diversification strategies that I've mentioned to you at the field scale. And looked at these outcomes like biodiversity, ecosystem services, and crop yield. So the way to read this graph is that if the mean and its 95% confidence interval lies to the right of the dotted line, it means that there was a positive, significant effect of the diversification practice compared to the less diversified situation. And so you can see for biodiversity and for most of the ecosystem services, all except climate regulation, in fact, we do have a positive and significant effect of diversification on these outcomes. Now, you might be wondering, well, what about crop yield? Because we tend to think if we're doing agriculture more sustainably in this way, more biodiversity friendly, et cetera, oh, well, there's going to be a trade-off and there's going to be a reduction in crop yield. But we did not see that. What we see is it's completely neutral. It's not better, it's not worse in this giant meta-analysis. There's been another study done subsequently that analyzed only the above ground practices, again at the field scale, so they left out the soil ones. And they also found, they had a bit of a larger study going further back in time. They found similar results to us in terms of the biodiversity and ecosystem services, but they actually found a positive yield effect. So using these practices actually increases yield. So it is possible, in a way, to have your cake and eat it too. It is possible to do sustainable agriculture and support these multifunctional benefits while also being more productive. What about evidence for multifunctionality at the landscape scale? Here I'm going to focus not on the landscape heterogeneity, but just on this aspect of embedded semi-natural habitat. There have been 2 systematic reviews, one of which I was part of, that show the critical role of these semi-natural habitat patches within agriculture for supporting biodiversity and a wide array of ecosystem services. And I don't have time to go into all of this, but one interesting thing is that both studies independently found that you need about 20 to 25% of the area within any piece of farmland as a minimum threshold for supporting these ecosystem services. And I'll come back to that point later. So it seems that these diversification practices, there really is a lot of evidence that they can create this multifunctionality that we need for a regenerative and sustainable agriculture that is also productive. What about connectivity? Evidence for connectivity. So we are still finishing up a systematic literature review on the effects of diversification practices on the movement of organisms. And this is led by Gaurav Singh Varma in my lab, and to date it includes data on over 145, or on 145 vertebrate, invertebrate, and plant species. And in this study, we're again looking at the effects of these diversification practices and asking for each of the studies that we're screening, that we're extracting data from, we're asking, does the diversification practice compared to a less diversified situation improve the movement of the given species, or is it neutral, or does it actually impede the movement? And so you can see 2 things from this graphic. First of all, that over the majority of studies across scales are positive. So we're seeing that these diversification practices do seem to promote movement more than they would impede it, for sure, or in some cases they're neutral. And there's also a lot more data at the landscape scale or around field borders. So how we have this divided is landscape scale, field border, and then within the field. To give you a little bit more sense of how we're scoring these studies, I'm going to go through the scoring of one specific study by Natalia Estrada Carmona. She studied, along with a team, the species movements of 5 bird species using detection relocation data and modeled with CircuitScape over 7 years in a coffee agroforest landscape in Costa Rica. And upon having the CircuitScape model, they did scenarios where they digitally altered the fields and assessed the likely effect on movement. And so in the first scenario, it was a scenario of within field conversion from a simplified coffee to a coffee agroforest. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through this, but the color scheme is basically showing you the net movement probabilities. Yellow is a bit of movement, and red a little bit more, and then green a lot. So this is the business as usual for each of the species, showing the likely movements, distributions for each species, and this is the scenario with adding more trees in coffee agroforest inside these fields. And you don't see a whole lot of differences for most of the species. It's pretty much the same, so that would be scored as a neutral. But for one species, it was actually, there was less movement, so that would be scored as a negative. So this one would have gotten 2 boxes, 1 for neutral, 1 for negative. And in the second scenario, they added more live fences around fields. So this would be our field border addition classification. And so that one we can see here. There's a little bit brighter yellow in each case for each of the bird species, a little bit more green as well. And so they were all positive. And so this would have gotten 1 square for positive. So that's how we do the scoring. A limitation of our data set so far is that only less than 16% of the data that we've encountered is based on direct movement measures, such as using GPS data or telemetry. Most of it is indirect, as the one that I just showed you, which was detection relocation with simulation. And we think that's because there hasn't been much of a focus on doing these kinds of movement-based studies in agricultural regions, and especially with respect to diversification practices. So that's a limitation that maybe we can change in the future. Meanwhile, there is a lot of movement data out there, and in our lab, Angela Brennan a couple of years ago led a project using this GPS data to calculate mammalian movement probabilities across the globe, again using CircuitScape, with protected areas as nodes. So we're looking at trying to assess the functional connectivity of protected areas. So these are mammalian movement probabilities that are being mapped here, and the yellow is the greater movement with the darker colors being lower movements. And so where I'm going with this is, where are the critical connectivity areas, the areas that we really definitely need to protect to make sure that our protected areas stay connected to one another? So what we see here is just the highest mammalian movement probabilities, above 90% from our analysis. And the color coding relates to their status. So dark green is protected, lighter green is prioritized in the global safety net, but not necessarily protected yet. And then the pinks and purples are places that another analysis showed are highly suitable for agriculture, so at risk of agricultural conversion. And unfortunately, when we look at how these are distributed, it's about 30% of these critical connectivity areas that are at risk of, that are not protected and that are at risk of agricultural conversion because of their high agricultural suitability. So this leads me to suggest that maybe for these at-risk critical conservation areas, agricultural diversification could be a better strategy than outright protection, because based on our finding that these diversification practices are showing some potential to promote connectivity at each of the scales that we've looked at. But what about these super intensive agricultural landscapes that we have really all over the planet? Here's 5 examples shown here. How do we build multifunctional multifunctionality and connectivity back into such intensive landscapes. So the second row of this matrix shows a land cover classification where brown is field and yellow is pasture, and the light green there is existing natural habitats for these five examples. Remember that target I told you about 20 to 25%? We need to get up to 20 to 25% of natural habitat in these landscapes to maintain the ecosystem services we need to help support the biodiversity that can persist in agricultural landscapes. So that's the third row down there. So adding in restoration around, restoring around the existing natural habitats or semi-natural habitats, and then building in some of these linear features to try to get connectivity back along riparian areas or on the edges of streams. But for the multifunctionality, I would argue we need to use all these techniques. We need to make sure that what's happening inside the field itself is sustainable and that we're not just spewing out all of these chemicals. And I would argue it's not a choice. Agriculture should not be a sacrifice zone. It's 40 to 50% of the habitable land. So given the impacts, we just simply have to do it. We have to do it for biodiversity, we have to do it for planetary health, and we have to do it to sustain our own food production. But on the bright side, I think it's possible. Even in the most intensive agricultural systems, wherever agriculture is, we can always do it better. So in the corn and soy region of the United States, which is shown here in the map, this is one of the most intensive agricultural systems in the world, and they use a huge amount of chemicals. These are nutrients that are running into the Mississippi River, a lot of pesticides as well, going down to the Gulf of Mexico and creating a huge dead zone there. So what can we do about that? Well, an intrepid biologist at the University of Iowa has convinced some farmers, to convert 10% of their farm with these prairie strips that you see there, and these sort of semicircular lines that you see in the lower graphic. So these prairie strips, the prairie grasses are deep-rooted, and they suck up about 80 to 90% of the nitrogen and phosphorus, which is just simply amazing. Just lock it up. And they also bring back prairie biodiversity. This is prairies in North America, one of the most threatened ecosystems that we have. So it's possible. So I've shown you substantial evidence of the role of agricultural diversification practices for multifunctionality, biodiversity, ecosystem services, and sustaining yields, even maybe making yields better in some cases. There's growing evidence, I've shown you growing evidence that these practices can enhance species movements and could be valuable for 30% of the critical connectivity areas that are at risk from agriculture. Bringing this back to biocultural diversity, the earth produces an enormous bounty of diverse foods that our human ancestors identified, cultivated, and enriched for us through ingenious methods of land stewardship, thinking forward for 7 generations. Learning from our ancestors' ways of doing things, we can use modern-day diversification methods to achieve the connected, multifunctional landscapes that we need to support planetary health, biodiversity, and ourselves. And I want to thank my lab members who have provided input into this talk, as well as the work that they've done, lots of colleagues that I've worked with, and the many scholars that have influenced my work. And then finally, again, a shout out to all of you for being here in this great conference. Thank you so much.